The world before the flood can be represented like this. We have a pristine world of beauty with a great sea, a great ocean, and seas fingering into the landmass. And that world was surrounded by a firmament canopy. That canopy of water was approximately 11 miles above the earth. Now, that firmament canopy of water did a wonderful thing. It filtered out the shortwave radiation from the sun and from stellar bodies. But the long wave and mid-spectral radiation would come right on in. That did something wonderful. The world before the flood had greater atmospheric pressure because of the gravitational weight of that firmament pushing in on the atmosphere. The world before the flood was protected from the harmful radiation. And that produced some very wonderful things. Essentially, everything in the fossil record was larger in the past than it is today. The great white shark today gets 36 feet long, but in the fossil record, he is 60 feet long. Something must explain that. In addition to that, this lepidodendron has its counterpart today. The very same form is the lycopsid club moss. It gets 16 inches tall at best. But in the fossil record, that very same plant is 150 feet tall. We're not evolving. We've lost something in the process, or lost the conditions that would permit the full expression of the life form. Did you get that? We are building a context at Glen Rose for the first time in history called the hyperbaric biosphere. And in that biosphere, we're going to be having 2.18 atmospheres of pressure. That's what the best of our research shows. That canopy, firmament, pushing in on the atmosphere would have introduced 2.18 atmospheres of pressure. We're going to introduce 25% oxygen, 0.25% CO2, carbon dioxide. That should make a world of difference, because that's what academically we find indicated in the fossil record. What will that do? Well, we have dragonflies today. Here in East Texas, the dragonflies get how big? About a 4-inch wingspan, maybe 5 inches. In the fossil record, that very same life form, the dragonfly, had a 36-inch wingspan. What explains that? The evolutionary concept cannot really explain that, because if the processes with increased energy, which I'll address in the next lecture, with increased complexity, is causing the forms to accelerate in complexity, they certainly should accelerate in dexterity and size. Well, that's not the case. We find they were bigger in the past. Human life forms were larger in the past, and incidentally, they were more intelligent in the past. But given these circumstances, with a little over 2 atmospheres of pressure, 25% oxygen in contrast to today's 21% oxygen, the brain, from conception on, would be hyperoxygenated, not to the point of toxicity. This is the perfect level, a little over 2 atmospheres of pressure, 25% oxygen. In the fetal formation of the brain, it would be enlarged to begin with. The cellular structure would be fed and nurtured from before the child was born. Then you would live in a context where your brain would be totally fed in all its capacity with oxygen. That means that every person sitting in this audience, if you were to live under these conditions and having been born under those conditions, would put Albert Einstein to shame in your intellectual capacity. You have that capacity. Why don't you use it? Well, we really can't. to our fullest capacity. But if our brains, if the blood plasma were hyperoxygenated today, that would solve a lot of problems. Oh, that does solve a lot of problems, including the dinosaurs. You see, with their small lung capacity, the hemoglobin cell can only take 4 oxygen molecules. Did you know that? The hemoglobin in the blood is saturated with 4 oxygen molecules. That's all it can take. And you can't get enough oxygen to the deep cell tissue of such bulk, size. But Texas A&M University has found that under 2 atmospheres of pressure with slightly enriched oxygen, all the blood plasma becomes saturated with oxygen. That means that overnight, an open wound heals. Today it takes 14 days for that open wound to heal. But overnight, under those hyperoxygenated contexts, an open wound heals. Now let's take it further. I think probably the best illustration of what it was like before the flood, or what it was like to recuperate before the flood, is found in the experience of a little girl, probably the most famous little girl in the world. Does anyone here recognize the name Jessica McClure? How many recognize the name Jessica McClure? Every hand in the building as far as I can see. Who's that little girl? She's a little girl who fell in a well, Midland, Texas. 58 and a half hours, her right leg was suspended behind her back. And for 58 and a half hours, her right foot was in her face. That's a pretty difficult position to be in. She's a brave little girl. I'm not sure I could have held out that long. When they got to her, her right foot, because of its suspension and the lack of blood supply and oxygen, her right foot was black, and they were sure they were going to have to amputate her foot. You know what they did for that little girl? They rushed her to the Midland Hospital, rushed her to a hyperbaric medical chamber. They put her under 2+ atmospheres of pressure, and they gave her 100% oxygen because they needed a quick fix. Now, she couldn't live under 100% oxygen for long periods of time, but they certainly needed it quickly. So they essentially put her in a context like pre-flood man had. What happened to her right foot? In a few hours, it turned pink. And then her toes began to turn pink. They thought at first they'd lose the entire foot. Then they thought, well, we're not going to lose the foot, we'll lose all her toes. Then her big toe turned pink. Second, third, fourth. They finally lost the little pinky because it wouldn't turn pink. Well, what I'm doing is introducing an overview of the creation model. It appears that her body was designed to function and repair itself under those circumstances. Well, if that's so, her body had to be designed. And if that's so, her long-lost predecessors lived under such a context. Well, that's the creation model. With a firmament canopy of water suspended above the earth, the furnace was in the floor, but not only would that have tremendous effects physiologically for animals, it would have tremendous effects for vegetation. And that effect would be as follows. It has been found that if you increase carbon dioxide and increase pressure, the plants grow tremendously. In fact, it has been found by experimentation of a Japanese physicist, Dr. Kiyomori, Keio University, Tokyo, Japan, who had a problem. Dr. Kiyomori lived in his house, but his office was in the basement. There's Dr. Mori behind his desk. You'd recognize him anywhere, wouldn't you? Hope the camera's got a close-up. That's Dr. Mori, believe it or not. But he has a problem. He doesn't have enough light in his basement, and he doesn't want to pay for any more electricity. That's always a problem. But Dr. Mori had an ingenious idea. He knew what fiber optics would do, and he had some fiber optic cable at the university. So he brought some home, with or without permission, I don't know. He brought some home and he ran it out the roof. Ran it through the rafters, down the walls, and into the basement. And sure enough, it worked. You know how fiber optic cables work. You can tie them in a knot, shine a light in one end, and the light will just follow all the way through the knot and come out the other end. Well, that's what happened here. So it worked. Light from the sun struck the cable, came right on down, and came out the bottom into his basement. Beautiful. What he forgot was that the dimension of the fiber optic cable that he had filtered out the ultraviolet spectrum of light. Now, that's important. It's the ultraviolet that's giving us most of the trouble we have today. In the next lecture, you'll see how it's destroying us. It's the ultraviolet that is a major problem. All right? That fiber optic cable filtered out the ultraviolet so that the light he got in his basement was essentially like the light we got before the flood, because water also filters out ultraviolet and shortwave radiation. Did you get that? The light that he got was like the light we had before the flood. So, Dr. Mori, being Japanese, wanted to plant something living. And he put a little tomato plant, just a natural tomato plant, in his basement. In a few weeks, the thing grew out of control. He knew he had something. So he went outside, built a platform, shielded that platform from ultraviolet radiation with a shielding process, plastic shielding process, put his tomato plant there, but he did something else. He knew that tomato plant, if it was going to grow that fast, needed a lot more carbon dioxide. Indications are in the fossil record that we had a lot more carbon dioxide than we had in the past. So he increased the carbon dioxide and pressure at the base of his plant. Guess what happened to his plant, his tomato plant? It grew. How well did it grow? Now remember, what he's doing is actually simulating primitively what it was like before the flood. What about those ages in the biblical record? Are they literal? Well, let's see if it'll do that for tomato plants. It ought to do that for us under those circumstances, shouldn't it? How old do you think would be a good age to live and still be in control and in command of your faculties? 80? Multiply 80 by 12. What do you get? 960. That has a 12-fold lifespan. Multiply your 80 by 12 and you get 960 years. That means that in certainly academic theory, the capability under those circumstances is for some of your ancestors to have lived 960 years. Did they? Sure they did. Methuselah lived older than that. Adam almost lived that long. But now it's better still. Let me wind up this introductory concept. This is just an overview. We've only introduced the concept. One of the nation's leading scholars is Dr. Edward Blick, University of Oklahoma, head of Aerospace Engineering Department. Dr. Edward Blick has stated in print that under these circumstances, with the firmament canopy filtering out the ultraviolet radiation, and under these circumstances, with the added pressure introduced by the gravitational weight of that firmament pushing in on the atmosphere, under those circumstances, with man's large lung capacity, man could run up to 200 miles without fatigue. How many would like to be able to run 200 miles without fatigue? Sure. How many would like to be able to run 200 miles? Well, how many would like to be able to run at all? Under those circumstances, it was absolutely utopian. But I've only touched the hem of the garment. It's much better still. Stay tuned. After a short break, we'll come back to the next lecture.